The fluorescent lights above the operating table flickered like dying stars as I felt consciousness slipping away from me. Dr. Martinez's voice became a distant echo, his urgent commands to the surgical team fading into a hollow whisper. "We're losing her," I heard him say, though his words seemed to come from another dimension entirely. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." I was supposed to be having routine gallbladder surgery. Routine. That's what my husband David had called it when he dropped me off at Mercy General that morning, barely glancing up from his phone as he kissed my forehead with the mechanical precision of a man going through the motions. "I'll be here when you wake up, sweetheart," he'd promised, his attention already drifting back to the urgent text messages that seemed to consume his every waking moment lately. Messages I'd noticed but never questioned, trusting in the 15 years of marriage that had taught me to believe in his love, even when his actions suggested otherwise. The anesthesia had been working perfectly until it wasn't. One moment I was counting backward from 10, the next I was floating somewhere between consciousness and the void, watching my own body on the operating table below. The monitors were screaming their electronic warnings while Dr. Martinez worked frantically to keep me alive. "Get me 2 units of O negative, stat," he barked at the surgical nurse. "And where's that damn anesthesiologist?" I wanted to tell them I was fine, that I was right there watching them work, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself drifting through the hospital walls like smoke, moving without direction or control toward the voice I knew better than my own heartbeat. David's voice. He was in the family waiting area, or so I thought. But as I drew closer, following some invisible thread that connected us across the boundaries of life and death, I realized he wasn't alone. And he wasn't in the waiting area where grieving families held vigil for their loved ones. He was in a private consultation room on the 3rd floor, one I'd never seen before. The kind of room where doctors delivered the worst possible news to families who weren't prepared to hear it. But David wasn't receiving bad news. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He was planning my funeral. "So you think the rosewood casket would be best?" The voice belonged to a woman I didn't recognize, though something about her tone suggested an intimacy that made my ethereal form recoil. "It matches the dining room set we picked out for the new house." "The new house?" I watched from my impossible vantage point as David nodded, his face bearing an expression of concentration I'd only seen when he was working on his most important business deals. This was business to him. The business of burying his wife. "Rosewood is perfect, Monica," he said, reaching across the small table to take her hand. Monica. I stored the name like a weapon, though I couldn't yet understand why. Elena always preferred darker wood anyway. "She'll look beautiful in it." The casual way he spoke about how I would look dead while I was potentially dying just floors below made something cold and furious crystallize in whatever remained of my consciousness. Beautiful in my casket. As if he were selecting a picture frame for a photograph rather than a final resting place for the woman who had spent 15 years believing she was loved. Monica squeezed his hand, her perfectly manicured nails painted a deep burgundy that seemed appropriate for the occasion. She was younger than me, they always were, weren't they, with the kind of polished beauty that came from expensive salons and unlimited time for self-care. The kind of woman who had never worked 3 jobs to put her husband through business school, who had never sacrificed her own dreams to support someone else's ambitions. "What about the service?" she asked, pulling out a tablet and stylus like she was planning a dinner party rather than a funeral. I was thinking something elegant but not too elaborate. "We don't want to seem wasteful when we're about to inherit everything." Inherit everything. The words hit me like a physical blow, and suddenly I understood why David had been so insistent about updating our life insurance policies 6 months ago. Why he'd suggested increasing the coverage, just to be safe. Why he'd been so adamant about me having this surgery even when Dr. Martinez had suggested we could wait another few months to see if the symptoms improved on their own. "The St. Catherine's Chapel should work perfectly," David continued, consulting what appeared to be notes he'd already prepared. Notes about my funeral, written while I was still alive and fighting for my life in surgery. "It's small enough to seem intimate but large enough for everyone from the firm. And the acoustics are excellent for the eulogy." He'd already written my eulogy. My husband had written my eulogy before I was even dead. What about Elena's family? Monica asked, though her tone suggested she hoped the answer would be minimal. Will they expect some kind of involvement in the planning? David's expression hardened slightly, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from him since discovering this macabre planning session. Elena's parents died in that car accident 5 years ago, remember? And her sister lives in Seattle, I doubt. She'll want to make the trip for more than just the service itself. Besides, as Elena's husband, all the decisions are legally mine anyway. The casual dismissal of my sister Sarah, who had called me every week without fail since our parents' death, who had begged me to move to Seattle after David's business started. Requiring so much travel, stung almost as much as everything else. Sarah would absolutely make the trip. She would move heaven and earth to be here for my funeral, and she would ask questions that David clearly didn't want to answer. Perfect, Monica purred, making a note on her tablet. That keeps everything simple. Have you thought about what you'll say in the eulogy? David leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It was the same smile he'd worn when he closed his first $1 million deal, the expression of a man who had successfully manipulated a situation to his advantage. I've got it mostly drafted, he said, pulling out his phone and scrolling through. What I could only assume were the prepared remarks about my life and death. Loving wife, devoted partner, taken too soon. The usual. I'll mention how brave she was, facing this surgery even though she was scared. How she wanted me to be happy. If anything happened to her. Lies. All of it lies. I hadn't been scared of the surgery, David had been the one insisting it was too dangerous to wait, pushing me to schedule it immediately despite my preference to try conservative treatment first. And I had never, not once, told him I wanted him to be happy if something happened to me. What wife says such things? But I was beginning to understand that David had been building a narrative for months, maybe longer. Creating a story that would explain his quick remarriage to Monica, his immediate access to my life insurance, his sudden windfall when my investments and retirement accounts transferred to him as my beneficiary. The life insurance company will need a death certificate within 30 days, Monica said, checking something on her tablet with the efficiency of someone who had researched the process thoroughly. But that shouldn't be a problem, right? Surgical complications are pretty straightforward. Surgical complications. They were talking about my death like it was a foregone conclusion, like the monitors screaming downstairs were just a formality. Before the paperwork could begin. But what terrified me most was the clinical way Monica discussed the insurance timeline, as if she'd been studying the process for months. Dr. Martinez is completely above board, David assured her, though something in his tone made me wonder if that would remain true. The surgery legitimately carried risks, especially given Elena's reaction to anesthesia during her appendectomy 10 years ago. If she doesn't make it through, it'll be a tragic but explicable medical event. My reaction to anesthesia. I'd had a mild allergic response during my appendectomy, nothing life-threatening, just enough to make recovery slightly more complicated. But I'd told David about it, trusted him with that medical history, never imagining he would catalog it as a potential weapon. What about the house? Monica asked, and I noticed she was now holding what appeared to be real estate listings. I know Elena loved that old Victorian, but it's really not practical for our lifestyle. The market is perfect for selling right now. Our house. The Victorian I'd fallen in love with the moment we'd walked through the front door 15 years ago. The house where I'd planted the garden that David now complained required too much maintenance. The house where I'd dreamed of raising children before David decided his career was more important than starting a family. The house where I'd waited up countless nights, believing his explanations about late business meetings and weekend conferences. The Riverside property you showed me last week would be perfect, David agreed, apparently having already toured replacement homes with his mistress. Modern, low maintenance, and the master suite has that view of the river you loved. They'd been house hunting together. While I was scheduling surgery and worrying about medical bills, my husband and his girlfriend were selecting our future home, planning our future life, arranging our future free from the inconvenience of my existence. Monica leaned across the table, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper that somehow carried clearly to my floating consciousness. I can't wait to wake up next to you in that house, knowing we'll never have to sneak around again. No more hotel rooms, no more careful scheduling, no more lies about where you're spending your evenings. It's been torture, hasn't it? David's voice was tender in a way I hadn't heard in years, certainly not directed at me. All those business trips where I wished you could come with me, all those dinners where I had to pretend to be the devoted husband while thinking about you. The business trips. The late nights. The sudden need for so many weekend conferences in cities where I'd suggested joining him, only to be told it would be boring for me, that I'd just be sitting in hotel rooms while he attended meetings. All lies. All carefully constructed alibis. For a relationship that had apparently been going on for months, possibly years. After the funeral, how long do you think we should wait before making things official? Monica asked, and I realized she was wearing a ring I'd never seen before, not an engagement ring, but something expensive and meaningful. I don't want people to think it's too rushed, but I also don't want to wait forever. David considered. This with the same careful calculation he brought to his business ventures. 6 months seems appropriate for appearances. Long enough to seem respectful, short enough that people won't be surprised. I'll gradually mention how you've been such a support during my grief, how Elena would have wanted me to find happiness. Again. Elena would have wanted me to find happiness again. The presumption of it, the audacity of putting words in my dead mouth to justify his betrayal, sent waves of fury through my disembodied consciousness. But more than anger, I felt a growing sense of clarity about what had really been happening in my marriage. The signs had all been there, hadn't they? The phone calls he took in other rooms, claiming they were boring work conversations. The sudden need for a gym membership and new cologne. The way he'd become critical of things about me that had never bothered him before. My laugh was too loud, my cooking wasn't adventurous enough, my clothes were too conservative for his increasingly upscale social circle. I'd attributed it all to midlife restlessness, the natural evolution of a long marriage. I'd tried harder, thinking that if I just became more interesting, more attractive, more supportive, David would return to being the man I'd fallen in love with. I'd never considered that the man I'd fallen in love with might not have existed in the first place, that David might be someone who was simply good at becoming what people needed him to be until it was no longer convenient. What about Elena's personal things? Monica was asking, making another note on her tablet. The jewelry, clothes, all those books she collected? David waved dismissively. The jewelry has some value, especially her grandmother's pieces. We can sell most of it and keep a few items for sentimental appearances. As for the rest, donate it all. Those books are worthless, and her clothes definitely won't fit you. Her grandmother's jewelry. The pieces that had been passed down through 3 generations of women in my family, each piece carrying stories and memories that David was discussing like assets to be liquidated. The emerald earrings my grandmother wore to her wedding. The pearl necklace my mother had saved for months to restore for my 16th birthday. All of it reduced to some value in David's calculations. I do love that antique writing desk in her study, Monica mused, apparently having already taken inventory of my possessions. It would look perfect in the new house's office. My writing desk. The place where I'd spent countless hours working on the novel I'd never shown David, the memoir about my parents that he'd dismissed as dwelling on the past, the poetry that he'd said wasn't practical but that felt like breathing to me. The desk where I'd hidden my private journals, my real thoughts about our marriage, my growing doubts about David's faithfulness. My journals. Suddenly, with crystalline clarity, I realized that David had been in my study recently. Items had been slightly moved, books reshuffled, drawers that I always left precisely organized showing signs of careful searching. He'd been looking for something, evidence that I suspected him, perhaps, or information that might complicate his plans. Has she written anything lately? Monica asked, as if reading my ethereal thoughts. Any diaries or letters we should be aware of? David's expression shifted slightly, the first sign of uncertainty I'd seen since discovering them. Elena's always been a writer, but she keeps most of it private. I've never really paid attention to what she was working on. But he had been paying attention, hadn't he? The careful searching of my study suggested he was very concerned about what I might have written, what I might have observed or suspected. Unfortunately for David, he'd never been as thorough as he thought he was. My real journals, the ones containing my growing suspicions about his behavior, weren't in the obvious places he'd searched. they were in a safety deposit box he didn't know about, along with copies of financial records that had started looking suspicious, photographs of him with Monica that I'd discovered by accident, and a letter I'd written to my sister Sarah detailing my concerns about David's behavior and my marriage, insurance against a future I'd hoped would never come, but that some instinctive part of me had been preparing for anyway. We should probably go through her computer, Monica suggested. Delete anything that might be misinterpreted. Good thinking, David agreed. Elena was always paranoid about backing things up to the cloud, but I have all her passwords. We'll make sure nothing complicated survives. All her passwords. Except that I'd changed them 6 months ago when I'd started noticing unusual activity on my accounts, emails disappearing, files moved, subtle signs that someone had been monitoring my digital life. The passwords David thought he knew would lead him to decoy accounts I'd created, filled with innocuous content designed to satisfy casual snooping, but they were running out of time to implement their plans, weren't they? Even as they sat in that consultation room dividing up my life and possessions, my body was fighting for survival on the operating table below. Dr. Martinez and his team were working against the clock, and despite David's apparent confidence in my demise, surgical teams at Mercy General had a reputation for miracles. The monitors in the operating room had stopped screaming. I felt a pull, gentle but insistent, drawing me back toward my body like a tide returning to shore. The voices of David and Monica began to fade, their words becoming distant and hollow as my consciousness was drawn inexorably back toward the fluorescent lights and urgent medical voices. "We've got her back," Dr. Martinez was saying, his voice tight with relief and exhaustion. "Pulse is stabilizing. Someone get her husband, tell him she's going to be okay." But I wasn't okay, was I? I was returning to a life that had been built on lies, to a marriage that was actually a carefully constructed trap, to a husband who had been planning my funeral while I fought for my life. I was returning to a world where the person I trusted most had betrayed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. As consciousness slowly returned to my physical form, one thought crystallized with perfect clarity: David and Monica thought they had planned the perfect crime, the perfect betrayal, the perfect inheritance scheme. They had no idea that their intended victim had heard every word, and now, armed with knowledge they never intended me to possess, I was very much alive and ready to turn their perfect plan into their perfect nightmare. The game, as they say, was about to change dramatically. The first thing I noticed as consciousness returned was the beeping. Steady, rhythmic, reassuring, the sound of a heart monitor confirming that I was, despite David's plans, very much alive. The second thing I noticed was the antiseptic smell of the recovery room, sharp and clinical, cutting through the lingering fog of anesthesia like a knife through silk. The third thing I noticed was David's voice in the hallway, and the barely contained frustration in his tone. "What do you mean complications?" he was saying, his voice carrying that edge of irritation he usually reserved for incompetent business associates. The surgery was supposed to be routine. How does someone just stop breathing during routine surgery? Dr. Martinez's response was measured, professional. "These things happen, Mr. Hartwell. Your wife had an unexpected reaction to the anesthesia. We lost her for approximately 3 minutes, but we were able to resuscitate her. She's stable now, and we expect a full recovery." 3 minutes. I had been clinically dead for 3 minutes, long enough to discover the truth about my marriage, but short enough that I could return to do something about it. The irony wasn't lost on me that David's perfect plan had been undone by the very medical emergency he'd been counting on to succeed. "But she's going to be okay?" There was something in David's voice that made my skin crawl. Not relief, exactly. More like someone asking if a business deal was still viable after an unexpected complication. "Completely," Dr. Martinez assured him. "She'll need a few days to recover from the surgery and the trauma of the cardiac event, but there's no reason she can't make a full recovery. You can see her in a few minutes, she's just starting to wake up." I closed my eyes quickly as footsteps approached my bed, forcing my breathing to remain steady and deep as if I were still unconscious. Through my lashes, I watched David enter the recovery room, his face carefully arranged in an expression of concerned devotion. Behind him trailed a nurse I didn't recognize, clipboard in hand. "Elena?" David's voice was soft, tender, perfectly calibrated for the nurse's benefit. "Sweetheart, can you hear me?" I let my eyelids flutter, as if fighting to consciousness, buying myself time to think. What did David know about what had happened during those 3 minutes? Was there any possibility he suspected I had somehow witnessed his consultation with Monica? Or did he assume, like any rational person would, that clinical death meant complete unconsciousness? David? I whispered, my voice hoarse from the breathing tube they'd removed. The word felt foreign in my mouth, like speaking the name of a stranger rather than my husband of 15 years. I'm here, baby, he said, taking my hand in both of his. His touch, once comforting, now felt like ice against my skin. You gave us quite a scare. The doctors say you're going to be fine, though. Us. As if Monica had been in the waiting room, nervously pacing and praying for my recovery instead of selecting caskets and planning real estate purchases. What happened? I managed, though I knew exactly what had happened. I had died long enough to discover that my marriage was a lie, my husband was a fraud, and my life was worth more to him as a payout than as a partnership. You had a reaction to the anesthesia, David explained, his thumb tracing circles on my hand in a gesture that had once been soothing but now felt calculating. Your heart stopped for a few minutes, but Dr. Martinez got you back. Everything's going to be fine now. The nurse made a note on her clipboard. Mrs. Hartwell, do you remember anything unusual? Sometimes patients who experience cardiac events during surgery report strange dreams or sensations. I felt David's grip on my hand tighten almost imperceptibly. This was it, the moment that would determine everything that followed. If I admitted to any memories from those 3 minutes, it might raise questions that David couldn't afford to have asked. But if I claimed complete unconsciousness, I would lose the element of surprise that might be my only advantage. Just darkness, I lied, looking directly into David's eyes as I spoke. Like falling asleep and then waking up here. Did I miss anything important? The relief that flashed across David's face was subtle but unmistakable. He squeezed my hand, and for a moment, his smile was genuinely warm, not because he loved me. I now understood, but because his plan was still viable. Nothing important at all, sweetheart, he assured me. I was just here waiting for you to wake up, worried sick. Monica from my office sent flowers, she heard about the surgery and wanted to wish you well. Monica from his office. The casual lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly that I wondered how many times he'd practiced it. I let my gaze drift to the corner of the room where, indeed, an elaborate flower arrangement sat on the windowsill. White lilies and roses, funeral flowers, I realized with a chill. Monica's idea of a joke, perhaps, or simply a woman with a macabre sense of irony choosing flowers for the woman whose funeral she'd been planning an hour earlier. That was thoughtful of her, I said softly, filing away another piece of evidence. I don't think I've met her. She's new to the marketing department, David explained with practiced ease. Very professional, very dedicated to her work. Very dedicated indeed. Dedicated enough to help plan my funeral, tour replacement houses, and catalog my possessions for disposal. The audacity of it was almost admirable in its completeness. Dr. Martinez appeared at the foot of my bed, chart in hand. And relief evident on his face. Mrs. Hartwell, welcome back. How are you feeling? Tired, I admitted, which was true enough. And confused. David said my heart stopped. For approximately 3 minutes, Dr. Martinez confirmed. It's more common than you might think with certain anesthesia reactions, especially given your medical history. But you responded beautifully to resuscitation, and all your signs are now completely normal. My medical history. The appendectomy reaction that David had catalogued as a potential weapon. I wondered if he'd somehow influenced the anesthesia protocol, suggested certain medications, or simply relied on chance and my documented sensitivities. Either way, the result had been exactly what he'd hoped for, except for the inconvenient detail of my successful resuscitation. When can I go home? I asked, though the Victorian house that had once represented safety and love now felt like returning to a beautifully decorated trap. We'll want to monitor you overnight, Dr. Martinez said, making notes on my chart. If everything looks good in the morning, you should be able to go home tomorrow afternoon. The surgical incisions are healing perfectly, and the cardiac event didn't cause any lasting damage. David nodded approvingly, but I caught a flicker of something, disappointment? Frustration, that he quickly masked. Whatever you think is best, doctor. I just want Elena to be completely healthy. After Dr. Martinez left and the nurse finished her checks, David and I were alone in the recovery room. The silence stretched between us, filled with 15 years of shared history that I now understood had been largely fabricated on his part. How long had he been planning this? When had the man I married become someone capable of such calculated betrayal? I should let you rest, David said finally, though he made no move to leave. Instead, he pulled his chair closer to my bed, his expression shifting to one of intimate concern. Elena, I need to tell you something. When I thought I might lose you today, it made me realize how precious our time together is. The irony was breathtaking. David was actually going to use my near-death experience, the very event he'd been hoping would free him to marry Monica, as an opportunity to demonstrate his devotion. What do you mean? I asked, though I suspected I knew exactly what performance was coming next. David took both my hands in his expression earnest and loving in a way that would have melted my heart just hours earlier. Now it felt like watching a master actor deliver lines he'd rehearsed for months. I've been thinking about our marriage lately, he began, his voice heavy with manufactured emotion. About whether we've grown apart, whether we still make each other happy. But today, when I thought I might lose you forever, Elena, I realized I'd rather spend one day married to you than a lifetime with anyone else. The words were beautiful, poetic even. They were also complete lies, delivered by a man who had spent the morning planning my funeral with his mistress. But David was watching my face carefully, gauging my reaction, so I gave him what he expected to see: tears of gratitude, overwhelming relief that our marriage troubles were finally being addressed. Oh, David, I whispered, letting my voice break with emotion. I've been so worried that you were losing interest in me, in us. You've seemed so distant lately, so preoccupied with work. I know, he said, squeezing my hands as if anchoring me to this moment of manufactured intimacy. I've been under enormous pressure at the firm, and I took it out on you. That's going to change, I promise. Starting now, you're my priority. My only priority. My only priority. Except for Monica, the new house they'd selected, the life insurance policies, and the careful timeline for transitioning from grieving widower to happily remarried man. But I nodded gratefully, tears streaming down my face as if his words were healing 15 years of marital wounds instead of confirming the depth of his betrayal. I love you so much, I told him, and was surprised to realize that some part of me still meant it. Not love for who David actually was, but love for who I had believed him to be. Grief for the marriage I'd thought we had, the future I'd thought we were building together. I love you too, sweetheart, David replied, leaning down to kiss my forehead with what appeared to be genuine tenderness. More than you'll ever know. After David left, promising to return early the next morning to take me home, I lay in the hospital bed staring at Monica's funeral flowers and processing the magnitude of what I'd learned. My husband was planning to murder me for insurance money. My marriage was a facade designed to provide him with financial security and social respectability. The man I'd supported through business school, encouraged through career struggles, and trusted with my deepest vulnerabilities had been systematically planning my destruction, but David had made one critical error in his calculations: he'd underestimated me. The Elena he thought he'd married was the woman I'd presented to him 15 years ago, supportive, trusting, content to live in his shadow while he built his career. But that Elena had been shaped by youth and inexperience, by a desire to be loved that had made me willing to diminish myself to fit into someone else's vision of the perfect wife. The Elena who had died for 3 minutes and returned with full knowledge of his betrayal was someone else entirely. Someone who had spent 15 years learning David's weaknesses, his patterns, his vulnerabilities. Someone who had built her own networks, developed her own skills, accumulated her own resources, even if I'd hidden them behind the facade of devoted wifehood. David thought he'd been planning the perfect crime, but he'd actually been providing me with the perfect motivation for revenge, and unlike David's plan, which relied on chance and medical complications, mine would be built on certainty and David's own psychological weaknesses. I knew exactly how his mind worked, how his pride operated, what fears kept him awake at night. I knew his business contacts, his financial situation, his professional reputation. Most importantly, I knew Monica, or at least, I now knew she existed and was actively participating in planning my demise. The first step was information gathering. I needed to understand the full scope of David's betrayal, how long the affair had been going on, what financial preparations he'd made, whether there were other people involved in his plan. I needed copies of documents, records of conversations. Evidence that would not only protect me but ensure that David and Monica faced consequences for their actions. The second step was building my own resources independently. David thought he controlled our finances, our social circle, our shared life. He was about to discover that the woman he'd underestimated had been quietly building her own foundation for years, not because I'd suspected his betrayal, but because some instinctive part of me had always known that independence was survival. The third step would be the systematic destruction of everything David had built, using his own methods against him. If he wanted to play games with life insurance and inheritance, I would show him how those games worked when played by someone who understood the rules better than he did. If he wanted to trade one wife for another, I would make sure the cost of that transaction was higher than he could afford to pay. But first, I needed to get out of this hospital bed and return to the house where David thought he had successfully deceived me for years. I needed to become the grateful, loving wife he expected to see, the woman who had been given a second chance at life and was determined to make the most of it with her devoted husband. David had no idea that his perfect victim had just become his perfect nemesis. The 3 minutes I'd spent clinically dead were about to become the foundation for making his life a living hell, and the beautiful part? He was going to help me do it, step by step, lie by lie, until the trap he'd built for me became the prison that would destroy him instead. The heart monitor continued its steady beeping, marking time until I could begin showing David exactly what happened to men who tried to bury their wives before they were actually dead. The drive home from the hospital was a masterclass in deception on both sides. David maintained a steady stream of concerned chatter, how worried he'd been, how grateful he was that I'd recovered, how he'd rearranged his entire schedule to take care of me during my recovery. I responded with appropriate gratitude and affection, playing the role of the devoted wife who had been given a second chance at life with her loving husband. Neither of us mentioned that we were both lying through our teeth. "I've taken the rest of the week off," David announced as we pulled into our driveway, his tone suggesting this was a significant sacrifice rather than a necessity for someone whose wife was supposed to be dead by now. "I want to make sure you have everything you need while you recover. The rest of the week." Which meant he expected to be back to his normal routine, including his relationship with Monica, by Monday. I wondered if they'd already pushed back their timeline for the funeral planning, or if David was simply adapting to the temporary inconvenience of my continued existence. "You don't have to do that," I protested weakly, though every instinct screamed that having David home would complicate my investigation. "I know how important the Morrison account is right now." David's expression flickered, surprised that I'd remembered the name of his current major client, perhaps, or concerned that I might be paying more attention to his work than he'd realized. But he recovered quickly, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "Nothing is more important than you, Elena," he said, and the sincerity in his voice was almost convincing. "The Morrison account can wait. You're my priority now." As we walked up the front steps of our Victorian house, I tried to see it through new eyes, not as the home David and I had built together, but as the crime scene it had apparently become. How many times had Monica been here while I was out? How many of our private conversations had David shared with her? How many of my possessions had they already discussed dividing after my death? The house felt different somehow, as if the very walls had absorbed the poison of David's betrayal. The living room where we'd hosted dinner parties, the kitchen where I'd made his coffee every morning for 15 years, the study where I'd hidden my private journals, all of it contaminated by the knowledge that my husband had been systematically planning my destruction. "Why don't you rest on the couch?" David suggested, settling me onto the sofa with unnecessary fussing. "I'll make some tea and get your prescription from the pharmacy." Perfect. The moment he left, I would have my first opportunity to begin gathering evidence. But I needed to be careful. David was clearly more observant than I'd given him credit for, and any sign that I suspected him could prove dangerous. "That sounds wonderful," I agreed, leaning back against the cushions with a weak smile. "I am feeling a bit dizzy still." David's concern appeared genuine as he tucked a blanket around me and kissed my forehead. "That's normal after what you've been through. Just rest, and I'll be back in 20 minutes. The moment his car pulled out of the driveway, I was moving. Despite the surgical incisions and lingering effects of anesthesia, adrenaline propelled me toward David's home office with single-minded determination. If he'd been planning my death for months, there would be evidence, financial documents, insurance papers, communications with Monica that he'd thought were safely hidden. David's office had always been his private domain, but I'd cleaned it countless times over the years and knew exactly where he kept important documents. The filing cabinet beside his desk contained our personal financial records, including the life insurance policies he'd insisted on updating 6 months ago. Hands shook as I pulled out the insurance folder, partly from medication and partly from anticipation. The policies were even worse than I'd feared. David had somehow convinced me to sign documents increasing my coverage to $2 million while reducing his own to a fraction of that amount. I barely remembered the signing session, only David's explanations about how it was a tax strategy, a way to protect our assets if something happened to me as the higher earner. That was another lie I'd apparently been living. According to the financial records in David's filing cabinet, his income had increased substantially over the past 2 years while mine had remained static. The business trips I'd thought were modest successes had apparently been major windfalls, generating commissions and bonuses that David had never mentioned. More disturbing was a folder labeled estate planning that contained detailed calculations of what David would inherit upon my death. Not just the insurance money, but my retirement accounts, my half of the house value, my small but valuable stock portfolio that I'd built through careful investing over the years. Added together, David's financial gain from my death would exceed $3 million. $3 million. Enough to start a new life with Monica, buy that modern house they discussed, live comfortably without the burden of a wife who had apparently outlived her usefulness, but the most damning evidence was hidden in a manila envelope tucked behind the insurance papers. Photos of David and Monica together, clearly taken over a period of months. Not just business meetings or casual encounters, but intimate dinners, weekend trips, moments of obvious romantic connection. Someone had been documenting their relationship systematically. Private investigator photos, I realized, though whether they were hired by someone suspicious of the affair or by David himself for some other purpose, I couldn't tell. My hands trembled as I examined the photographs, seeing my husband's betrayal documented in excruciating detail. Monica was younger than me but not dramatically so, maybe early 30s to my 38. She was beautiful in a polished, professional way that suggested money and time for self-care. In every photo, David looked happier than I'd seen him in years, his face animated with an enthusiasm that had been absent from our interactions for longer than I cared to calculate. The final photograph in the stack made me gasp audibly. David and Monica standing in front of a modern house with a "for sale" sign in the yard, both of them smiling as if they'd just made an offer. The timestamp showed it was taken 3 days ago. While I was preparing for surgery, David had been house hunting with his girlfriend. I quickly photographed the most damaging documents with my phone, my hands shaking as I tried to capture clear images of the insurance policies, financial records, and relationship photos. Evidence that would be meaningless if David discovered I'd found it, but invaluable if I could build a case around it. The sound of David's car in the driveway sent me scrambling back to the living room, where I arranged myself on the couch with practiced casualness. By the time he walked through the front door, I was the picture of an invalid recovering from major surgery. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" David asked, settling the pharmacy bag on the coffee table and studying my face with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Better," I lied, though in truth I was feeling infinitely worse. The rest helped. David prepared my medication with the attentiveness of a devoted husband, carefully measuring out pills and bringing me water to wash them down. For a moment, I wondered if the pills were actually what they purported to be, or if David might use this opportunity to accelerate his timeline. But paranoia was a luxury I couldn't afford. If I started suspecting every gesture, I'd be paralyzed by fear instead of empowered by knowledge. "I called your sister while I was out," David mentioned casually, settling into the chair across from me. "Sarah was worried when she heard about the surgery. I told her you came through with flying colors and would call her when you're feeling stronger." Sarah. My sister who lived in Seattle, who called every week without fail, who had begged me to visit more often because she sensed something was wrong in my marriage. Sarah, who would ask uncomfortable questions if anything happened to me, who would never accept David's explanations without investigation. What did you tell her exactly? I asked, keeping my voice casual despite the importance of his answer. Just that you'd had a minor complication during surgery but were recovering. Perfectly, David replied. She wanted to fly out immediately, but I convinced her it wasn't necessary. No point in worrying her over something that turned out fine. No point in having potential witnesses around while he figured out his next move, more likely. Sarah's absence from my recovery would seem natural to outside observers, but it also eliminated someone who might notice inconsistencies in David's behavior or ask probing questions about our marriage. That was thoughtful, I agreed. She has her hands full with the kids anyway. David nodded, apparently satisfied that he'd successfully managed another potential complication. But he'd made an error. Sarah and I had developed a code over the years for situations where one of us might be in trouble but couldn't speak freely. If David had really spoken to her, Sarah would have found a way to contact me directly within hours to verify that I was actually okay. The fact that my phone showed no missed calls from my sister told me everything I needed to know about David's supposed conversation with her. Over the next few hours, I played the role of the grateful recovering patient while internally cataloging every detail of David's behavior. He was attentive but distracted, caring but somehow mechanical in his gestures. Twice his phone buzzed with text messages that he quickly silenced without reading, though I caught glimpses of a contact name that started with M. Monica, presumably, wondering why the funeral planning was on hold. I should probably check in with the office, David said around dinner time, his tone suggesting reluctance, though I could see the eagerness in his eyes. Make sure the Morrison account isn't imploding without me. Of course, I agreed immediately. I'll probably just go to bed early anyway. The medication is making me drowsy. David's relief was subtle but unmistakable. Whatever conversation he needed to have with Monica required privacy, and my early bedtime would provide the perfect opportunity, but I had no intention of sleeping. The moment David retreated to his office for his business call, I would begin the second phase of my investigation. However, as I listened to the familiar sound of his office door closing and the low murmur of his voice beginning what I now knew was a planning session with his accomplice, I realized that my exploration of his filing cabinet had only scratched the surface. There were deeper secrets hidden in this house, secrets that might reveal not just the scope of David's betrayal, but the full extent of the danger I faced. Secrets that might mean the difference between survival and becoming another casualty in whatever larger plan David and Monica had been executing. The real investigation was just beginning, and time was running out faster than I'd initially understood. David's phone call lasted exactly 47 minutes. I knew because I'd been listening from the hallway outside his office, my ear pressed against the door like a spy in my own home. The conversation was conducted in hushed tones, but certain words carried clearly through the wooden barrier: postponed, complications, timeline, and most chillingly, alternative methods. Alternative methods. The phrase echoed in my mind as I crept back to the living room, arranging myself on the couch before David emerged from his office. Whatever plan A had been, my convenient death during surgery, they were apparently already developing plan B. Everything okay at work? I asked when David returned, noting the tension in his shoulders and the tight line of his mouth. Fine, he said curtly, then seemed to remember he was supposed to be the devoted husband. Just some client concerns about deadlines. Nothing that can't be handled. But David was a terrible liar when he was stressed, and I'd learned to read his tells over 15 years of marriage. The way he rubbed his left temple meant he was anxious. The slight stutter on certain consonants indicated he was fabricating rather than reporting. And the way he avoided eye contact told me that whatever he discussed with Monica had been far from routine business. I think I'll take a bath before bed, I announced, standing slowly and maintaining the careful movements of someone still recovering from surgery. The hospital stay left me feeling so grimy. That's a good idea, David agreed, though he was already reaching for his laptop. Take your time. I have a few more calls to make. More calls. Or perhaps more detailed planning with Monica about these alternative methods they'd discussed. Either way, his distraction would give me the opportunity one needed to access the evidence I'd hidden years ago in the one place David would never think to look. The master bathroom had been renovated 5 years earlier, and during the construction. I'd created a small hiding space behind the new vanity. Not because I was paranoid, but because every woman needs a place for private documents, the kind of papers that represent independence and security, the kind that controlling husbands often try to access or reorganize for their wives' own. Good.my emergency cache contained copies of financial records, birth certificates, social security documents, and most importantly, the private investigator's report I'd commissioned 6 months ago when David's behavior had become too suspicious to ignore. Richard Chen had been recommended by my divorce attorney friend Lisa, though I'd never told Lisa why I was asking. I'd hired him to investigate David's business trips, his sudden late nights, his growing disinterest in our marriage. What Richard had discovered was both exactly what I'd feared and far worse than I'd imagined. The report, sealed in waterproof plastic and hidden behind my vanity for months, contained photographs that made David's hidden collection look amateur. By comparison, Richard had documented not just David's affair with Monica, but a pattern of infidelity that stretched back 3 years. Monica wasn't his first mistress, she was simply the most recent and most ambitious, but the truly damning information wasn't about David's philandering. It was about his financial arrangements with these women. Richard had uncovered a systematic pattern of financial manipulation. David had been using his affairs to gain access to insider information, client contacts, and business opportunities through the women he seduced. Monica worked in marketing at a competing firm, giving David access to their client strategies and bidding information. His previous mistress, Catherine, had been a bank loan officer who'd fast-tracked David's business credit applications. Before her, there had been Jennifer, a city planning commissioner who'd given David advance notice of zoning changes that made his real estate investments incredibly profitable. David wasn't just an unfaithful husband, he was a calculating predator who used romantic relationships as business intelligence operations. The report also contained financial records that Richard had obtained through methods I'd chosen not to question. David's income wasn't just higher than he'd told me, it was exponentially higher, hidden through a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts. The modest lifestyle we'd maintained wasn't due to financial constraints but to David's desire to keep me unaware of his true wealth. Most disturbing was Richard's analysis of David's insurance strategy. He'd identified the pattern months before I'd understood it myself: the gradual increases in my life insurance coverage, the careful documentation of my medical history, the subtle changes in beneficiary arrangements that would maximize David's payout while minimizing tax consequences. Richard's professional opinion, stated in clinical language at the end of his report, was that David Hartwell was systematically preparing for his wife's death while positioning himself to benefit maximally from that event. He'd recommended that I take immediate steps to protect myself, including changing my will, establishing independent financial accounts, and considering whether to confront David or simply leave him. I'd chosen a third option: waiting and gathering more evidence while secretly preparing my own countermeasures. A decision that had nearly cost me my life, but had also provided me with information that could destroy David completely. Hidden with Richard's report were documents that David had no idea existed. I'd quietly established my own offshore account, funded through freelance writing work I'd done under a pseudonym. I'd also changed my will without David's knowledge, leaving everything to my sister Sarah with detailed instructions about investigating my death if it occurred under suspicious circumstances. Most importantly, I'd prepared a safety deposit box with copies of all evidence against David, along with instructions for Richard Chen to deliver everything to the authorities if I died unexpectedly, but all of those precautions assumed I would die unaware of David's plans. The knowledge I'd gained during my 3 minutes of clinical death changed everything. Instead of being a passive victim hoping posthumous evidence would bring justice, I could now actively defend myself while building an even stronger case against my would-be murderers. I photographed every page of Richard's report with my phone, uploading the images to an encrypted cloud account David couldn't access. Then I began composing a detailed email to Richard, explaining what I'd overheard during my near-death experience and requesting an urgent meeting to discuss next steps. Richard's response came within minutes: "Can you meet tomorrow at 2 p.m? Coffee shop on 5th Street where we met before. This is urgent, there have been developments." Developments. My heart raced as I deleted the messages and returned my physical evidence to its hiding place. What kind of developments could Richard have discovered while I was unconscious in the hospital? Back in the living room, David was hunched over his laptop, his face illuminated by the screen in a way that made him look predatory rather than handsome. Whatever he was working on required intense concentration, and he barely looked up when I announced I was going to bed. "Sleep well, sweetheart," he murmured absently. "I'll be up in a few hours." But I had no intention of sleeping. Once safely in our bedroom with the door closed, I began implementing the first phase of my counterattack. Using my phone, I accessed the encrypted messaging app I'd used to communicate with Richard during his initial investigation. Time to activate networks that David had no idea existed. My first message went to Lisa, my divorce attorney friend. "Need to discuss urgent legal matter. Can you meet tomorrow morning? It's about David, situation has escalated." Lisa's response was immediate, of course. 10 a.m. at my office. "Are you in immediate danger?" The question gave me pause. Was I in immediate danger? David had certainly been planning my death, but my survival had clearly disrupted his timeline. The alternative methods he discussed with Monica suggested they weren't abandoning their plan, but they would need time to recalibrate. "Not immediate, but situation is serious," I replied. "We'll explain everything tomorrow." My second message went to my sister Sarah. "David says he called you about my surgery, but I don't see any missed calls. Can you confirm? This is important." Sarah's response came quickly. "Despite the late hour on the West Coast, he absolutely did not call me. I found out about your surgery from your neighbor Janet, who saw the ambulance. I've been trying to reach you for hours. What the hell is going on?" Perfect. David's lie about contacting Sarah was documented, adding another piece to the puzzle of his deception. But Sarah's mention of Janet seeing the ambulance raised new questions. How much had our neighbors observed? Were there other witnesses to David's behavior that I could potentially use? My third message was the most important. "Richard, after our meeting tomorrow, I need you to implement the safety protocols we discussed. The situation has become active. Also need you to investigate Monica Reyes from Hartwell's firm and any connections to medical professionals at Mercy General." The medical angle had been bothering me since I'd regained consciousness. My allergic reaction to anesthesia during the appendectomy had been documented, but it had been mild, certainly not enough to cause cardiac arrest under normal circumstances. Either I'd been extraordinarily unlucky, or someone had ensured that my documented sensitivities would be exploited during the surgery. Richard's response was immediate. "Safety protocols activated. We'll have Monica information by morning." Medical angle very interesting. Have been tracking unusual pattern of surgical complications at Mercy General. See you at 2 p.m. Unusual pattern of surgical complications. My blood ran cold as the implication sank in. If Richard had been tracking similar cases, it suggested that David and Monica weren't operating alone. They might be part of a larger network, a systematic operation targeting wealthy spouses through orchestrated medical accidents. Which meant I wasn't just fighting for my life against my husband and his mistress, I was potentially up against an entire organization of people who specialized in making murder look like medical misfortune. The sound of David's footsteps on the stairs sent me scrambling to delete my message history and hide my phone under my pillow. By the time he entered our bedroom, I was lying perfectly still with my eyes closed, breathing in the deep, regular pattern of someone in medicated sleep. David moved quietly around the room, preparing for bed with the careful silence of someone trying not to wake an invalid spouse. But I could feel him watching me, studying my face in the darkness as if trying to determine whether I suspected anything. After what felt like hours, David's breathing finally settled into the rhythm of sleep. Only then did I allow myself to process the full magnitude of what I discovered. David's betrayal wasn't just personal, it was part of a larger criminal enterprise. Monica wasn't just his mistress, she was his partner in a murder conspiracy. And my survival wasn't just an inconvenience to their plans, it was a threat to an entire network of people who had apparently been getting away with murder for years, but they'd made one critical error in their calculations. They'd assumed that their victim would remain ignorant until it was too late to fight back. Instead, they'd created an enemy who understood their methods, knew their weaknesses, and had already begun building the case that would destroy them all. As I lay in the darkness next to my would-be murderer, listening to him sleep peacefully, While planning his downfall, one thought crystallized with perfect clarity. David and Monica thought they were playing chess against an unconscious opponent. They were about to discover they'd been playing against a grandmaster who had been studying their moves for years, and who now had access to their entire playbook. The game was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The morning brought David's concerned fussing and the careful performance of devoted husband duties, bringing me coffee in bed, asking repeatedly about my pain levels, insisting I stay home and rest while he handled some urgent business matters that had developed overnight. "I hate leaving you alone so soon after the surgery," David said, straightening his tie with the mechanical precision of a man whose mind was elsewhere. "But there's a crisis with the Morrison account that requires immediate attention." The Morrison account. I'd heard him use that excuse so many times over the past months that it had become meaningless background noise. Now I understood it was code for meeting with Monica, planning their next moves, coordinating with whatever network of accomplices had been helping them orchestrate my murder. "I'll be fine," I assured him, maintaining the weak smile of a recovering patient. "I'm just going to sleep most of the day anyway." David's relief was subtle but unmistakable. He kissed my forehead with practiced tenderness, and I had to suppress the urge to recoil from his touch. How many times had he kissed me while planning my death? How many loving gestures had been calculated performances designed to maintain his cover? The moment his car disappeared around the corner, I was moving. My meeting with Lisa was in 2 hours, followed by the crucial conference with Richard Chen. But first, I needed to implement some basic security measures in case David returned unexpectedly or decided to have me monitored. I'd learned basic surveillance detection from Richard during our initial meetings: how to spot a tail, how to vary routes and timing, how to communicate without leaving digital traces. Skills I'd hoped never to use, but that were now essential for survival. My first stop was the bank where I'd maintained a small account David knew nothing about. The safety deposit box I'd rented under my maiden name contained enough cash to disappear if necessary, along with copies of crucial documents and a prepaid phone for emergencies. I added the photographs I'd taken of David's insurance papers and the evidence from his office, creating a redundant record that would survive even if my house was somehow compromised. Lisa Morrison's law office occupied the top floor of a downtown building that specialized in high-stakes corporate litigation. She'd built her reputation representing women in complex divorce cases, particularly those involving hidden assets and financial manipulation. When I'd first met her at a charity fundraiser 3 years ago, I'd never imagined I'd need her professional services. Now she might be the only thing standing between me and a carefully orchestrated murder. "Elena, you look terrible," Lisa said without preamble as her secretary ushered me into her private office. "When you said the situation with David had escalated, I was expecting marital problems, not this." I'd caught a glimpse of myself in the lobby mirror, pale, hollow-eyed, moving with the careful gait of someone whose body had recently been through trauma. But the physical damage was nothing compared to the psychological impact of learning that the person I'd trusted most in the world had been systematically planning my destruction. "It's worse than marital problems," I said, settling into the leather chair across from Lisa's imposing desk. "David has been planning to kill me for insurance money, and yesterday he almost succeeded." Lisa's expression shifted from concern to sharp professional focus as I outlined everything I'd discovered: the overheard funeral planning, the insurance policies, the affair with Monica, the suspicious circumstances of my cardiac arrest during surgery. She took notes in shorthand, occasionally stopping me to ask for clarification or additional details. "Do you have proof of any of this?" Lisa asked when I'd finished my account. I pulled out my phone and showed her the photographs I'd taken of David's documents, watching her expression grow increasingly grim as she reviewed the evidence. "This is good," she said finally, "but it's mostly circumstantial. The insurance policies are suspicious but not illegal. The affair is morally reprehensible but not criminal. Even the funeral planning could be explained as grief-driven contingency planning, especially if David claims he was devastated by your near-death experience." "What about the medical angle?" I pressed. My reaction to the anesthesia was much more severe than it should have been given my documented sensitivities. Lisa leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers in the gesture I recognized as her thinking pose. "That's more promising, but we'd need expert medical testimony to prove deliberate sabotage." Do you have any evidence that David or Monica had contact with medical personnel at the hospital? I shook my head, though I made a mental note to discuss this angle with Richard. Not yet. But my private investigator is looking into it. Good. In the meantime, we need to focus on protecting you legally and financially. Lisa pulled out a legal pad and began writing rapidly. First, we're changing your will immediately. Everything goes to your sister, with detailed instructions about investigating suspicious circumstances. Second, we're establishing a revocable trust that David can't access even as your husband. Third, we're documenting everything through a series of sealed letters that will be opened if anything happens to you. The efficiency with which Lisa outlined these protections was both reassuring and terrifying. How many other women had sat in this office, discovering that their marriages were elaborate traps designed to facilitate their own murders? There's something else, Lisa continued, her expression growing more serious. You mentioned that your private investigator has been tracking similar cases at Mercy General. If David is part of a larger network, we're not just dealing with a domestic murder plot, we're potentially looking at organized crime. That changes everything about how we approach this. Organized crime. The phrase sent a chill through me as I considered the implications. If David was connected to a network of people who specialized in murdering wealthy spouses, then my survival didn't just threaten his personal plans, it threatened an entire criminal enterprise. Which meant the danger I faced was exponentially greater than I'd initially understood. What do you recommend? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Honestly? You should disappear. Today. Right now. Take the cash from your safety deposit box, get on a plane to Seattle, and let me handle this from a distance while you're safe with your sister. The advice was logical, practical, and probably the smartest course of action. It was also impossible for me to follow. I can't run, I said firmly. If I disappear, David will know I'm onto him. He'll destroy evidence, disappear himself, or find some other innocent woman to target. And if there really is a network of people doing this, they'll just continue operating while I spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. Lisa nodded as if she'd expected this response. Then we do this the hard way. We build an airtight case while keeping you alive long enough to see it through. But Elena, you need to understand, what you're proposing is incredibly dangerous. If these people are willing to commit murder for money, they won't hesitate to eliminate a witness who threatens their operation. I understand, I replied, though I wasn't sure I truly grasped the magnitude of what I was undertaking. But I died for 3 minutes yesterday, Lisa. I literally died and came back with knowledge that could stop these people from hurting anyone else. I can't waste that opportunity just to save myself. 2 hours later, I sat across from Richard Chen in the same corner booth of the 5th Street coffee shop where we'd first met 6 months ago. Richard looked exactly as I remembered, mid-50s, unremarkable in the way that made him perfect for surveillance work, with sharp eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his surroundings, but today there was an urgency in his manner that hadn't been present during our previous meetings. He slid a thick folder across the table, his expression grim. What you overheard during your surgery confirms something I've been investigating for the past year, he said without preamble. David isn't just planning to kill you for insurance money, he's part of a sophisticated network that's been operating for at least 5 years. I opened the folder, my hands trembling as I saw photographs of David with people I didn't recognize, financial records showing payments from shell companies, and what appeared to be an organizational chart mapping connections between various individuals. How many people are involved? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. At least 12 that I've identified so far, Richard replied. David and Monica are mid-level players. The operation is run by a woman named Catherine Blackwood. She's a former insurance investigator who uses her knowledge of the system to identify targets and orchestrate their deaths. She recruits couples like David and Monica, provides them with methods and support, and takes a percentage of the insurance payouts. I stared at the photograph of Catherine Blackwood, an elegant woman in her 50s with silver hair and the kind of refined appearance that would make her welcome at any social gathering. She looked like someone's sophisticated aunt, not the mastermind of a murder network. How does it work? I asked, though I was afraid to hear the details. Richard pulled out another set of documents. Catherine identifies wealthy individuals with substantial life insurance policies, usually through her contacts in the insurance industry. She then arranges for one of her couples to get close to the target, sometimes through existing relationships, sometimes by engineering new ones. The couples spend months or years building trust and gaining access to the target's life, medical information, and financial details. The systematic nature of it was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. These weren't crimes of passion or desperation, they were business transactions, with human lives as the commodity being traded. When they're ready to move, Catherine arranges for the murder to look like an accident or medical event, Richard continued. She has contacts at several hospitals, including Mercy General. Medical professionals who can be bribed to overlook inconsistencies or even actively participate in causing complications during routine procedures. My cardiac arrest during gallbladder surgery suddenly made perfect sense. Someone at the hospital had deliberately triggered my allergic reaction to the anesthesia, knowing my medical history would make it seem like a tragic but explainable event. Who's the contact at Mercy General? I asked, dreading the answer. Richard consulted his notes. Dr. Patricia Williams, the anesthesiologist who was supposed to monitor your surgery. She called in sick at the last minute and was replaced by Dr. Rodriguez, who isn't part of the network. That's probably why you survived, the replacement doctor actually tried to save you instead of ensuring you died. Dr. Williams. I vaguely remembered meeting her during my pre-surgical consultation, a thin woman with nervous energy who'd asked detailed questions about my previous reactions to anesthesia. I'd thought she was being thorough. Instead, she'd been gathering information to ensure my death would seem medically plausible. Where is Dr. Williams now? I asked. That's the interesting part, Richard said, his expression growing even more serious. She disappeared yesterday afternoon, right around the time you would have been declared dead if the plan had worked. Catherine's people are cleaning house, eliminating anyone who might become a liability now that you've survived. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Dr. Williams wasn't just a corrupt medical professional, she was a potential witness who could expose the entire network. Her disappearance suggested that Catherine Blackwood's organization was willing to murder their own accomplices to protect the larger operation. Am I safe? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Richard's expression was grim. For now, yes, but only because they need time to regroup. Your survival has disrupted their timeline and exposed their methods. Catherine will want to assess how much you know and whether you pose a threat to the network before deciding how to proceed. And if they decide I'm a threat, then they'll try to kill you again, but they'll be more careful this time. No medical accidents, probably something that looks like a home invasion, car accident, or random violence. Something that can't be traced back to David or the network. I thought about David's attentive behavior that morning, his insistence on leaving me alone while he handled business matters. Had he been meeting with Catherine, discussing their options for dealing with the complication of my continued existence? What do you recommend? I asked, though I suspected Richard's advice would be similar to Lisa's. Honestly? Disappear. Get as far from here as possible and let law enforcement handle this. I have enough evidence to expose the network, but building a prosecutable case will take months. They won't wait that long to eliminate you. I can't run, I said, echoing my earlier conversation with Lisa. If I disappear, they'll know I'm onto them. They'll destroy evidence and disappear themselves, and the network will just re-establish somewhere else. Richard nodded as if he'd expected this response. Then we need to be smarter than they are. The network's strength is also its weakness, they operate on established patterns and protocols. If we can predict their next moves, we can stay ahead of them while building our case. He pulled out a timeline showing the network's previous operations. Based on their history, they'll spend 2 to 3 days assessing the situation and planning their response. That gives us a small window to gather additional evidence and establish protections. What kind of protections? Public exposure, Richard said simply. The network operates in shadows, relying on secrecy and the appearance of random tragedy. If we can make their activities public, they lose their most important asset, plausible deniability. I thought about the implications of going public with my story. The media attention, the scrutiny of my marriage, the transformation of my private nightmare into public entertainment. But if it would save other potential victims and bring justice for those who had already died, it was a price worth paying. How do we do it? I asked. Richard smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. Very carefully, and with perfect timing. We need to make sure we have enough evidence to be credible, but we also need to move before they can silence us permanently. As we discussed the details of our plan, I felt a mixture of terror and determination. I was about to go to war with an organization that had successfully murdered dozens of people without being caught. But I was also armed with knowledge they never intended me to possess, allies they didn't know existed, and the kind of righteous fury that comes from discovering that the person you loved most in the world has been systematically planning your destruction. David thought he was dealing with the same trusting wife who had gone into surgery yesterday morning. He was about to discover that his perfect victim had become his perfect nemesis, and that the network he joined for easy money was about to become the instrument of his complete destruction. The war for my life was about to begin in earnest. The next 72 hours unfolded with the precision of a military operation. Richard had been right about the network's patterns. They needed time to assess and plan, which gave us exactly the window we needed to implement our counterattack, while David maintained his performance as the devoted husband, constantly checking on my recovery and insisting I rest. I was systematically dismantling his entire world from the comfort of my own living room. The first breakthrough came when Richard's contact at the FBI confirmed that they'd been investigating suspicious insurance payouts connected to medical deaths for over a year. Agent Sarah Martinez, no relation to my surgeon, had been building a case against Catherine Blackwood's network but lacked the inside information needed to prove the conspiracy. Your testimony changes everything, Agent Martinez explained during our clandestine meeting at a downtown parking garage. We've suspected the network existed, but we've never had someone who could provide first-hand evidence of their planning process. I handed her copies of all the evidence Richard and I had gathered, the photographs, financial records, insurance documents, and most crucially, the detailed account of what I'd overheard during my 3 minutes of clinical death. The challenge will be corroborating your out-of-body experience, Agent Martinez continued. Defense attorneys will argue that surgical patients under anesthesia often have hallucinations or false memories. We need additional evidence to support your account. That's where Richard's surveillance expertise proved invaluable. Over the past 6 months, he'd been documenting David and Monica's relationship with professional-grade equipment, creating a video record that perfectly matched the details I'd overheard in the hospital consultation room. We have them discussing funeral arrangements, life insurance payouts, and property disposal, Richard reported as we reviewed the footage. The timestamp shows these conversations took place while you were literally dying on the operating table. But our most devastating evidence came from an unexpected source, Monica herself. Richard had managed to plant surveillance devices in Monica's apartment during one of her meetings with David. What we discovered was a woman so arrogant about her success that she'd been recording her own conversations with Catherine Blackwood, apparently as insurance against potential betrayal within the network. Monica's recordings revealed the full scope of their operation. Catherine's network had successfully murdered 43 people over 5 years, generating over $30 million in insurance payouts. The victims were carefully selected based on their wealth, their isolation from protective family members, and their access to medical care that could be compromised. Most chillingly, the recordings revealed that I wasn't David's first target. He'd been responsible for the death of his previous wife, Jennifer, 3 years before he met me. Jennifer's death had been ruled a tragic accident, a fall down the stairs in their home while David was conveniently away on a business trip. The insurance payout from Jennifer's death had funded David's courtship of me, making me literally a replacement victim purchased with blood money. We have enough evidence to take down the entire network, Agent Martinez confirmed after reviewing Monica's recordings. But we need you to help us catch them in the act of planning your second murder attempt. The plan required me to play the most dangerous role of my life, the oblivious victim who had no idea she was being targeted. Agent Martinez's team would monitor my movements and communications while I deliberately made myself vulnerable to another attack, providing the network with an opportunity to incriminate themselves. The moment they make a move against you, we'll intervene, Agent Martinez promised. You'll be under constant surveillance, with backup ready to respond within seconds. But even with FBI protection, the risk was enormous. Catherine Blackwood's network had been successful for years because they were careful, patient, and utterly ruthless. If they suspected a trap, they would disappear and re-establish their operation elsewhere, leaving other potential victims vulnerable. The trap was set for Friday evening. David announced that he'd arranged a romantic dinner at home to celebrate my recovery, complete with my favorite wine and a meal prepared by a private chef, a luxury we'd never indulged in during our 15-year marriage. "I want tonight to be special," David explained as he helped me dress for dinner, his hands gentle on my shoulders as he fastened my grandmother's pearl necklace around my neck. "I realized how close I came to losing you, and I want to show you how much you mean to me." The irony was breathtaking. David was using my near-death experience, the very event he'd orchestrated, as justification for a romantic gesture designed to facilitate my actual murder. The private chef arrived at 6 o'clock sharp. Tall, thin, professional, with the kind of efficient manner that suggested he'd cooked for wealthy clients many times before. What David didn't know was that Chef Marcus was actually Agent Rodriguez, an undercover FBI operative trained in both culinary arts and tactical response. We sat down to dinner. I could see the surveillance team's vehicles positioned discreetly around our neighborhood. Richard was monitoring from a van down the street, while Agent Martinez coordinated from FBI headquarters. Every word spoken in our dining room was being recorded by multiple devices, creating an evidentiary record that would be impossible to dispute. David was charming throughout dinner, reminiscing about our early relationship, apologizing for his recent distance, promising a future of renewed intimacy and shared adventures. If I hadn't known he was planning to kill me, I might have believed his performance and felt grateful for his renewed attention. The poisoning attempt came during dessert. David excused himself to take a work call, leaving me alone with Agent Rodriguez, who was clearing dishes in the kitchen. When David returned, he was carrying 2 glasses of champagne and wearing the satisfied expression of a man whose plan was proceeding perfectly. "To second chances," David said, raising his glass in a toast. "To second chances," I agreed, lifting my glass and pretending to drink while actually allowing the liquid to barely touch my lips.